Hello friends, today we're going to learn about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Before starting our summary, I want to discuss some characteristics with you for the better understanding of the summary. So, here we have Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. They both have 5 daughters named number 1 Jane Bennet, number 2 Elizabeth Bennet, number 3 Mary Bennet, number 4 Kitty Bennet, and number 5 Lydia Bennet. And then we have the main protagonist, Darcy, the friend of Charles Bingley. Charles Bingley is a rich person who came to Netherlands. Darcy have 2 sisters. Number 1, Fitzwilliam Darcy, and number 2, Georgina Darcy. And then we have Mr. Collins, the inherited or heir of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Collins worked for Lady Catherine. And then we have Mr. Gardiner and Mrs. Gardiner, the relative of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. And last we have George Wickham, a young military man. So friends, this was the character list which help you for the better understanding of the summary. So let's begin with summary without wasting our time. Hello friends, this was the summary notes of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Here I'm going to read it line by line, and as it was written in very simple English, hope you all understand the summary notes of the play. So here the summary, Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is the most famous of Jane Austen novel. It is one of the first romantic comedy in the history of novel, and its opening is one of the famous lines in English literature. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in wanted of a wife. Its manuscript was first written between 1796 and 1797 and was initially called First Impression, but was never published under that title. Following revision, it was first published on January 25, 1813. The news that a wealthy young gentleman named Charles Bingley has rented the manor of Netherfield Park caused a great stir in the nearby village of Longbourn, especially in the Bennet household. The Bennet have 5 unmarried daughters from oldest to youngest: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. And Mrs. Bennet is desperate to see them all married. After Mr. Bennet pay a social visit to Mr. Bingley, the Bennet attend a ball at which Mr. Bingley is present. Bingley at once falls in love with Jane and spends much of the evening dancing with her. However, his close friend Mr. Darcy is less pleased with evening and haughtily refused to dance with Elizabeth, Jane's younger sister. In his conversation with Bingley, he rejects Elizabeth as tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt him. This conversation is heard by Elizabeth too, and she comes to view him as an arrogant and obnoxious fellow. At social function over subsequent week, however, Mr. Darcy finds himself increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's charm and intelligence. Jane's friendship with Mr. Bingley also continues to burgeon, and Jane pays a visit to the Bingley mansion. On her journey to the house, she is caught in a downpour and becomes ill, forcing her stay at Netherfield for several days. In order to tend to Jane, Elizabeth also goes to Bingley mansion, but due to rain, she has to pass through muddy field and arrive with a sputtered dress, much to disdain of the snobbish Miss Bingley, Charles Bingley's sister. Miss Bingley's spite increased when she noticed that Darcy, whom she is pursuing, pays quite a bit of attention to Elizabeth. When Elizabeth and Jane return home, they find Mr. Collins visit the house. Mr. Collins is a young clergyman who stands to inherit Mr. Bennet's property, which has been entailed, meaning that it can only be passed down to male heirs. Mr. Collins is a pompous fool, though he is quite inherited by the Bennet girls. Shortly after his arrival, he announced that he would like to marry one of Bennet girls. Mrs. Bennet boasts that Jane is already engaged to Bingley and he should consider Elizabeth for this purpose. Thus he make a proposal of marriage to Elizabeth, which she turned down, wounding his pride. Meanwhile, the Bennet girls have become friendly with military officers stationed in a nearby town. Among them is Wickham, a handsome young soldier who is friendly towards Elizabeth and tells her how Darcy cruelly cheated him out of an inheritance. At the beginning of winter, the Bingley and Darcy leave Netherfield and return to London, much to Jane's dismay. A further shock arrived with the news that Mr. Collins had become engaged to Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend and the poor daughter of a local knight. Charlotte explained to Elizabeth that she is getting older and needs the match for financial reasons. Charlotte and Mr. Collins get married and Elizabeth promised to visit them at their new home. As winter progresses, Jane visits the city to see her friend, hoping also that she might see Mr. Bingley. However, Miss Bingley visits her and behaves rudely, while Mr. Bingley fails to visit her at all. The marriage prospect for the Bennet girl appear bleak. That spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte, who now live near the home of Mr. Collins' patron, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is also Darcy's aunt. Darcy calls on Lady Catherine and encounters Elizabeth, whose presence led him to make a number of visits to the Collins home, where she is staying. One day he makes a shocking proposal of marriage, which Elizabeth quickly refuses. Actually, during her stay at Mr. Collins' home, Colonel Fitzwilliam, a cousin of Darcy, informed her that Darcy was instrumental in persuading Bingley to leave Netherfield, and thus he separates Jane from Bingley. Therefore, she tells Darcy that she considered him arrogant and unpleasant, then scolds him for steering Bingley away from Jane and disinheriting Wickham. Darcy leaves her, but shortly thereafter delivers a letter to her. In this letter, he admits that he urged Bingley to distance himself from Jane, but claims he did so only because he thought their romance was not serious. Moreover, Elizabeth's mother and her sister had displayed poor manner which he disliked. As for Wickham, he informed Elizabeth that the young officer is a liar, and that the real cause of their disagreement was Wickham's attempt to elope with his young sister Georgia Darcy. This later causes Elizabeth to reveal her feeling about Darcy. She returns home and acts coldly towards Wickham. The military is leaving town, which makes the younger, rather man crazy Bennet girls distraught. Lydia managed to obtain permission from her father to spend the summer with an old colonel in Brighton, where Wickham Regiment will be stationed. With the arrival of June, Elizabeth goes on another journey, this time with the Gardiner, who are relatives of the Bennet. The trip takes her to the north and eventually to the neighborhood of Pemberley, Darcy Estates. She visits Pemberley after making sure that Darcy is away and delights in the building and grounds. While hearing from Darcy's servant that he is wonderful, generous master, suddenly Darcy arrives and behaves cordially towards her. Making no mention of his proposal, he entertains the gardener and invites Elizabeth to meet his sister. Shortly thereafter, however, a letter arrives from home telling Elizabeth that Lydia has eloped with Wickham and that the couple is nowhere found, which suggests that they may be living together out of wedlock. Fearful of the disgrace such a situation would bring on her entire family, Elizabeth hastens home. Mr. Gardiner and Mr. Bennet go off search for Lydia, but Mr. Bennet eventually returns home empty-handed. Just when all hope seemed lost, a letter comes from Mr. Gardiner saying that the couple has been found and that Wickham has agreed to marry Lydia in exchange for an annual income. The Bennet are convinced that Mr. Gardiner has paid off Wickham, but Elizabeth learned that the source of the money and of her family's salvation was none other than Darcy. Now, married Wickham and Lydia return to Longbourn briefly. When Mr. Bennet treats them coldly, they then depart for Wickham's new assignment in the north of England. Shortly thereafter, Bingley returned to Netherfield and resumed his courtship of Jane. Darcy goes to stay with him and pays visit to the Bennet, but make no mention of his desire to marry Elizabeth. Bingley, on the other hand, presses his suit and proposes to Jane, to delight of everyone but Bingley's haughtily sister. While the family celebrate, Lady Catherine de Bourgh pays a visit to Longbourn. She corners Elizabeth and says that she has heard that Darcy, her nephew, is planning to marry her. Since she considers a Bennet girl an unsuitable match for Darcy, Lady Catherine demands that Elizabeth promise to refuse him. Elizabeth sporadically refuses, saying she is not engaged to Darcy, but she will not promise anything against her own happiness. A little later, Elizabeth and Darcy go out, walking together, and he tells her that his feelings have not altered since the spring. She tenderly accepts his proposal, and both Jane and Elizabeth are married. Thus, the novel traces the relationship between Darcy and Elizabeth, hindered by the pride of Darcy and the prejudice of Elizabeth. The novel also presents a contrast between good and bad marriage. To Augustine, for a successful marriage, mutual understanding and respect for each other are essential prerequisites. One should not be carried away by outward appearance or love at first sight. Marriage is a social contract and it must pass the closer close circumcision of mutual understanding. Thus, only Darcy and Elizabeth marriage comes up to this standard. So thank you friends. Hope you all able to understand the summary, and if you have any questions related to this chapter, you can comment on the given box. So thank you.